The call came at 2:17 a.m., and it was the only thing in 6 years that made Ethan Carter's hand shake. He had been standing alone in his penthouse, 47 floors above Manhattan. The city stretched beneath him like a quiet constellation of lights, when his phone lit up against the glass table, the name on the screen unfamiliar, the number unlisted, and for a second, he almost ignored it because men like Ethan didn't answer unknown calls, not at that hour, not after everything he had built to keep his life controlled, measured, untouchable, but something he couldn't explain, made him pick it up anyway. Mr. Carter? The voice on the other end was soft, careful, like it was stepping into a room it didn't belong in, and Ethan straightened slightly, his jaw tightening as his reflection stared back at him in the dark window. A man in a tailored shirt, composed, distant, the kind of man people trusted with billion-dollar decisions, but never with their hearts. "This is Ethan Carter," he said, his voice steady, practiced, the same voice he used in boardrooms and interviews, the voice that had never once betrayed what he felt. There was a pause, just long enough for something unfamiliar to settle in his chest, something uneasy, something close to anticipation. "Sir, it's about your wife." The word hit harder than it should have, sharper than it had any right to after 6 years of silence, 6 years of distance, 6 years of pretending that the name Lily Brooks no longer existed in his world, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't respond immediately because his mind had already gone somewhere else, somewhere he had spent years trying to bury, somewhere that smelled faintly of cheap coffee and rain-soaked sidewalks, somewhere that started with a contract and ended with a door closing behind her. His grip on the phone tightened. "I don't have a wife," he said finally, the words automatic, cold, the same lie he had told himself over and over until it almost sounded true, but the voice on the other end didn't back down. "You did," she said gently. And just like that, the past didn't feel like the past anymore. It felt close. Too close. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, and in that darkness, he saw it all again, clearer than he wanted to, sharper than he remembered, the moment everything began. 6 years earlier, the rain had been steady, tapping against the windows of a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, the kind of place no one important ever went, the kind of place where a girl like Lily Brooks could sit unnoticed, her coat slightly worn, her hands wrapped around a cup she couldn't afford to refill, and Ethan had walked in without hesitation, his presence shifting the air without him even trying, his shoes too polished for the cracked tile floor, his watch worth more than everything in that room combined. He had seen her immediately, not because she stood out, but because she didn't belong in his world, and somehow, that made him stop. "I need a wife," he said, sliding into the seat across from her without asking, his voice calm, direct, as if he were discussing a business deal instead of a life, and Lily had looked up at him, confusion flashing across her face, her fingers tightening slightly around the cup. "I'm sorry, what?" Ethan didn't smile. He didn't soften. He simply placed the envelope on the table between them, thick, precise, final. "It's a contract," he continued, as if that explained everything, as if it made it normal, as if it made it acceptable. 3 years. Public appearances. No emotional attachment. Lily stared at him, her heartbeat loud in her ears, the kind of moment that should have felt absurd, impossible, and yet there was something in his tone, something in the way he spoke like this was just another decision, just another transaction, that made it real. "And after that?" she asked quietly. Ethan met her gaze, steady, unreadable. "We walk away." The rain outside grew heavier, the world beyond the glass blurring into something distant and unclear, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved, neither of them spoke, the space between them filled with everything that hadn't happened yet, everything that would change, everything that would eventually break. Back in the present, Ethan opened his eyes slowly, the city lights returning, cold and unchanged, but his chest felt different now, tighter, heavier, like something long buried had just been dragged back to the surface. "What about her?" he asked, his voice lower now, less certain than before, and on the other end of the line, the silence stretched just long enough to make him feel it, to make him realize that whatever came next was going to change everything all over again. The first thing Lily Brooks noticed was how quiet he was, not the kind of quiet that came from shyness, but the kind that came from someone who was used to being listened to without ever needing to raise his voice. And it made her uneasy in a way she could not quite explain, because everything about him felt out of place in her world. From the crisp lines of his coat to the way he looked at her like he was evaluating something rather than meeting someone. And yet there he was, sitting across from her in a cafe where the coffee cost $3 and the chairs wobbled slightly if you leaned too far back. She should have laughed. She should have told him to leave. Instead, she found herself staring at the envelope he had placed between them, her name not written on it, nothing personal about it at all, just a clean, sealed edge waiting to be opened. Why me? She asked finally, her voice steadier than she felt, because if this was some kind of joke, she refused to be the only one caught off guard by it. Ethan did not hesitate. Because you are not connected, he said simply, as if that was the most obvious answer in the world. No media presence. No ties to my competitors. No history that could be used against me. Lily let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. So you picked me because I have nothing. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, not quite regret, not quite agreement, but something close enough to make her notice. I picked you because you are uncomplicated, he corrected, though the word did not land any softer. Outside, a car passed, tires hissing against wet pavement, and Lily glanced briefly toward the window, as if reminding herself that the world was still moving, that this moment had not somehow frozen everything around her. And what do I get? She asked, turning back to him, because if this was real, if he was serious, then she needed to understand the cost of saying yes just as much as the cost of saying no. Ethan tapped the envelope once, a small, controlled motion. Financial security, he said. Immediate. Her fingers hesitated before reaching for it, the paper heavier than she expected when she finally pulled it toward herself. And when she opened it, her breath caught despite her efforts to stay calm, because the number printed on the first page was not just large, it was life-changing, the kind of number that did not belong in her world, the kind that could erase overdue notices and hospital bills, and the quiet panic she carried with her every night. 3 years, she murmured, scanning the lines, her eyes moving quickly but her mind struggling to keep up. Public appearances. Residency requirement. Confidentiality clause. Her throat tightened slightly when she reached the last section. No emotional involvement. Ethan watched her carefully, not with pressure, not with urgency, just with the patience of someone who already knew how this would end, and that unsettled her more than anything else because it meant he believed this was not a choice at all. It is simple, he said. You fulfill the role. I handle everything else. Lily looked up at him then, really looked this time, past the expensive watch and the controlled posture, past the confidence that seemed built into every movement. And she saw something else there, something quieter, something that did not match the certainty of his words. And for a brief moment, she wondered if he understood what he was asking, if he understood that this was not just a contract, not just an arrangement, but a life she would have to step into and eventually walk away from. And when it is over? She asked again, softer now. Ethan held her gaze, steady as ever. Then it is over. The finality of it settled between them, heavy and undeniable. And Lily felt her fingers tighten around the edge of the paper, the weight of her reality pressing in from all sides, the rent she could not pay, the future she could not see, the constant balancing act of surviving one more day. And suddenly the absurdity of this situation did not feel so absurd anymore. It felt like a door, a dangerous, uncertain door, but a door nonetheless. She exhaled slowly, her decision forming before she could stop it, before she could second-guess it, before she could ask herself if this was the kind of choice that changed everything. Okay, she said quietly. Ethan did not react immediately, but something shifted in his posture, something subtle, almost imperceptible, as if a piece of a plan had just fallen into place exactly as expected. Lily reached for the pen, her hand steady now despite everything, and as she signed her name on the line, she did not realize that she was not just agreeing to a contract. She was stepping into a story neither of them fully understood yet, one that would stretch far beyond 3 years, far beyond simple rules, and far beyond the promise that they could walk away without looking back. The next morning did not feel like the beginning of a new life, not at first, not in the way Lily had imagined big changes would feel. because there was no dramatic shift, no sudden clarity, just the quiet hum of the city waking up and the weight of a decision she had already made pressing gently but persistently against her chest as she stood outside her apartment building, her small suitcase by her side, her fingers curled tightly around the strap as if letting go might somehow undo everything. A black car waited at the curb, its surface polished to a mirror shine, completely out of place on her narrow street where most cars were older, scratched, and familiar. And when the driver stepped out to open the door for her, Lily hesitated for just a second, her eyes drifting back toward the building behind her, the cracked steps, the flickering hallway light she had learned to ignore, the place that had never really felt like home but was still the only thing she had known. "Miss Brooks?" the driver asked gently, not impatient, just waiting, and Lily nodded once, forcing herself forward because there was no version of this where she stayed and nothing changed. The ride through the city felt longer than it actually was, the familiar streets slowly giving way to cleaner avenues, taller buildings, quieter neighborhoods where everything looked deliberate and untouched, and Lily found herself sitting straighter without meaning to, her reflection faintly visible in the tinted window, her coat still the same, her hands still the same, but everything around her shifting into something she did not recognize. When the car finally stopped, she did not move right away, her eyes lifting to take in the building in front of her. All glass and steel and height, the kind of place she had only ever seen from the outside, and even then only in passing, never imagining she would walk through its doors. Inside, the air felt different, cooler, cleaner, quieter in a way that made every sound more noticeable, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, her suitcase wheels echoing faintly as she followed the driver toward the elevator where a man in a dark suit stood waiting, his posture straight, his expression neutral but attentive. "Welcome, Miss Brooks," he said, his voice smooth, practiced, as if he had said those words 1,000 times before, though never to someone like her. "Mr. Carter is expecting you." The elevator ride was silent except for the soft hum of movement, the numbers climbing higher and higher until Lily felt a slight pressure in her ears, a reminder of just how far she was being taken from everything familiar. And when the doors finally opened, the space beyond did not look like a home so much as it looked like a magazine spread, wide windows stretching from floor to ceiling, sunlight pouring in across sleek furniture arranged with careful precision, nothing out of place, nothing worn, nothing lived in. Ethan stood near the window, his back partially turned, one hand in his pocket, the other resting lightly against the glass as if he owned not just the room, but everything beyond it. And when he turned at the sound of her steps, there was no surprise in his expression, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement that she had arrived exactly as expected. "You are on time," he said, his voice even, as if punctuality was the only thing that mattered in that moment. And Lily set her suitcase down carefully, suddenly aware of how small it looked in a space this large. "I said I would be," she replied, her tone steady despite the way her heart seemed to beat a little faster in her chest. Ethan gave a slight nod, then gestured toward a folder placed neatly on the table nearby, another one, thinner than the envelope from before, but just as precise. "These are the details of your schedule, your wardrobe arrangements, and the events you will attend with me," he explained. "Everything has been organized." Lily walked over slowly, her fingers brushing the edge of the folder before opening it, scanning the pages filled with dates, times, locations, names she did not recognize, places she had never been, and for a moment, it felt less like a plan and more like a script she was expected to follow without deviation. "And what am I supposed to be?" she asked quietly, lifting her gaze back to him, because this part mattered more than any schedule. Ethan met her eyes without hesitation. "Convincing," he said simply. The word lingered in the air between them, heavier than it sounded, and Lily let out a small breath, closing the folder gently as she nodded once, more to herself than to him, because she understood now that this was not just about showing up, not just about appearances, but about becoming someone else entirely, at least for a while. "All right," she said, her voice softer but no less certain. Ethan studied her for a brief moment, as if measuring something unseen, then turned slightly, his attention already shifting to something else, some next step in a plan that had been set in motion long before she agreed to be part of it. And standing there in that quiet, immaculate space, Lily realized that whatever this was, whatever they had started, it was already moving forward, already unfolding, and there was no simple way back to who she had been before she walked through that door. By the end of the first week, Lily no longer recognized the girl who had stood on that narrow street, holding a worn suitcase. Not because she had changed entirely, but because everything around her had been carefully reshaped to fit a version of her that belonged in Ethan's world, and it happened faster than she expected, almost too fast for her to process, like stepping into a current that carried her forward whether she was ready or not. The mornings began early, earlier than she was used to, with a schedule that left little room for hesitation, fittings with stylists who spoke in soft, precise tones while adjusting fabrics she had never touched before, heels that added inches to her height, but demanded balance she had to learn quickly, and a woman named Claire who introduced herself as Ethan's executive assistant but seemed to know more about Lily's day than Lily did herself. You will have a luncheon at 12, followed by a brief appearance at a charity planning meeting, Claire explained one morning, handing her a tablet filled with notes, her voice efficient but not unkind, as if she understood this was all new but expected Lily to keep up anyway. Lily nodded, absorbing as much as she could. Though some of the names and details blurred together, her focus pulled instead to the way everything felt structured, intentional, like every step she took was part of a larger design she had only just begun to see. The clothes were the easiest part to notice but the hardest to accept, dresses tailored perfectly to her frame, fabrics that moved differently when she walked, softer, lighter, as if they carried their own quiet confidence. And when she looked at herself in the mirror, she saw someone who could stand beside Ethan Carter without drawing questions, someone who looked like she belonged even if she still felt like she was borrowing the role. "You are doing well," Claire said once, almost in passing, as Lily adjusted the sleeve of a fitted blazer, and the words lingered longer than Lily expected because they felt like the first acknowledgement that she was not entirely out of place. Ethan, on the other hand, remained consistent, controlled, present but distant, appearing when necessary, disappearing when not, his interactions with her always measured, always aligned with the purpose of the arrangement. And yet there were moments, small and unspoken, where something shifted just slightly, enough for her to notice even if she could not name it. At their first formal dinner, the room filled with voices that carried confidence and expectation, conversations flowing around her like a current she had to step into without hesitation, and for a brief moment as she stood beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly against his arm, she felt the familiar flicker of doubt, the quiet question of whether she could truly be convincing, whether she could hold her place in a world that was not built for her. "Relax," Ethan said quietly, not looking at her, but speaking just loud enough for her to hear, his tone low, steady, and something about the simplicity of it, the absence of judgment or pressure, grounded her in a way she had not expected. Lily drew in a slow breath, her posture straightening, her focus sharpening as she stepped forward into conversation, answering questions, offering polite responses, learning quickly when to speak and when to listen. And as the evening unfolded, something changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough for her to feel it, the shift from uncertainty to something closer to confidence, the realization that she could do this, that she could exist in this space without shrinking. Later that night, as the city lights stretched endlessly beyond the windows, Lily stood alone for a moment, her reflection staring back at her, composed, steady, almost unrecognizable from the girl who had signed that contract days before, and for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder not just how long she could maintain this role, but what it might mean if she started to become it. If the line between who she was and who she was pretending to be began to blur in ways neither she nor Ethan had planned for, and somewhere in the quiet of that thought, something else began to take shape, something subtle but undeniable, a connection forming not through grand gestures or dramatic words, but through the quiet rhythm of shared space, shared time, and the unspoken understanding that neither of them had fully accounted for when this all began. It did not happen all at once, not in a single moment anyone could point to, but somewhere between the scheduled events and the quiet hours in between, the distance Ethan had so carefully maintained began to shift in ways neither of them acknowledged out loud, and Lily noticed at first not in what he said, but in what he stopped saying. The rules were still there, written clearly in the contract she had signed, unspoken but understood in every interaction. And yet the sharp edges of those rules seemed to soften as the days turned into weeks, as routines formed without either of them planning them, as shared spaces became less formal and more familiar. It started with small things, almost too small to matter, like the way Ethan no longer left the room immediately after dinner, instead lingering just long enough to ask a simple question about her day, or the way he began to adjust his schedule without explanation, appearing at events he could have easily skipped, standing beside her not out of obligation, but with a presence that felt steadier, more intentional. Lily told herself it did not mean anything, that it was part of the arrangement, part of being convincing, but there were moments that did not feel rehearsed, moments that slipped past the boundaries they had agreed on. One evening, long after the city had quieted and the lights below stretched like a distant reflection of stars, Lily found herself in the kitchen, barefoot, the cool marble floor unfamiliar but no longer uncomfortable, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she had made herself because it was the one thing in that space that still felt like hers. She had not expected him to be there, not at that hour, not when his world usually ran on tight schedules and early mornings, but when she turned slightly, she saw him leaning against the counter, his sleeves rolled just enough to suggest he had been there longer than she realized. "You are still awake," he said, his voice quieter than usual, lacking the edge of formality she had grown used to. Lily nodded, offering a small, almost apologetic smile. "I could not sleep," she admitted, and for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt different from before, less distant, more aware. Ethan stepped closer, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but enough to close the space between them slightly, and Lily felt it, that subtle shift, that quiet awareness that had nothing to do with contracts or appearances. "You are adjusting faster than I expected," he said, his gaze steady but softer now, as if he was seeing her more clearly than before. Lily let out a small breath, her fingers tightening slightly around the mug. "I had to," she replied. There was not really another option. The honesty in her voice lingered, and for a brief moment, Ethan's expression changed, just enough for her to notice, just enough to suggest that he understood more than he let on. "There is always a choice," he said quietly, though the words did not sound as certain as they once might have. Lily looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she did not see just the man who had offered her a contract, not just the controlled, distant figure who moved through life with precision, but someone else, someone who carried something unspoken beneath all of that, something she had not expected to find. "And what about you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Did you have a choice?" The question hung in the air, unexpected, unguarded, and for a second, Ethan did not answer, his silence more revealing than any explanation could have been. He looked away briefly, his jaw tightening just slightly before he spoke again. "This was the most efficient one," he said, and Lily knew then that whatever had led him here was not as simple as he made it sound. The moment passed as quickly as it had formed, the space between them widening again just enough to remind her of the boundaries they had not crossed. But something had changed, something quiet but undeniable, and as Ethan turned to leave, pausing just long enough to glance back at her, Lily felt it settle deep within her chest, the realization that this arrangement was no longer just an arrangement, that somewhere along the way, without permission and without warning, it had begun to feel real, in ways neither of them had planned for. And that was the one thing the contract had never prepared them for. The night it almost became real did not arrive with grand declarations or carefully planned moments, but with something quieter, something far more dangerous, because it felt natural, unforced, like it had been building long before either of them realized it. And that was what made it impossible to ignore. It was after another long evening, another event filled with voices and expectations, where Lily had moved through the room with a confidence she no longer had to pretend, where Ethan had watched her not just as a partner in a contract, but as someone who belonged beside him in ways he had not accounted for. And when they returned to the penthouse, the silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full of something waiting just beneath the surface. Lily stepped out onto the balcony, drawn by the cool air, the city stretching endlessly below, lights flickering across the skyline in a rhythm she had started to recognize, and for a moment, She allowed herself to breathe without thinking about what came next, without thinking about rules or expectations or endings that had already been written. The door slid open softly behind her, and she did not need to turn to know it was him. Ethan stepped out beside her, his presence steady, familiar now in a way that no longer felt distant, and for a few seconds, they stood there without speaking, the quiet between them no longer uncomfortable, but charged with something neither of them addressed. "You handled tonight well," he said finally, his voice lower, less formal than it used to be, and Lily let out a small breath, her gaze still fixed on the city below. "I am getting used to it," she replied, though the words felt like more than just an observation, like an admission of how far she had come from the girl who once hesitated before stepping into his world. Ethan turned slightly toward her, studying her in a way that felt different now, less analytical, more personal, and Lily felt it, that shift, that awareness that had been growing between them without permission. "You are more than convincing," he said, and the words lingered in the air, heavier than they should have been, carrying something unspoken that neither of them had planned for. Lily turned then, slowly, meeting his gaze, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade, the city, the contract, the carefully drawn lines that had defined everything between them, leaving only the space they shared and the question neither of them had asked out loud. "That was not part of the deal," she said softly, not as a rejection, but as a reminder, as if saying it might bring things back to where they were supposed to be. Ethan did not look away. "No," he agreed, his voice quieter now, more honest than she had ever heard it. "It was not." The distance between them felt smaller than it had ever been, the air shifting in a way that made everything feel closer, more immediate, and Lily could feel her heart beating faster, not out of fear, but out of something she could no longer pretend was not there. For a brief moment, neither of them moved, as if both were waiting for the other to decide what happened next. And then Ethan took a step closer, not rushed, not uncertain, but deliberate, and Lily felt the world narrow to that single movement, to the space between them that no longer felt like a boundary, but like something about to be crossed. She should have stepped back. She should have reminded him of the rules, of the agreement they had both signed, of the ending that had already been decided before any of this began. But she did not. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, her breath catching slightly as his hand lifted, hesitating for just a fraction of a second before gently brushing a strand of hair away from her face, the touch brief, almost careful, but enough to make everything feel undeniably real. "Lily," he said quietly, her name sounding different in his voice now, not formal, not distant, but something else entirely, something that did not belong in a contract. And for a second, just 1 second, it felt like everything might change, like the lines between them might finally disappear, like the story they had been pretending to tell might become something true. But then it stopped. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a subtle shift, a realization that passed between them without words, and Ethan stepped back, the space returning just enough to remind them of what this was supposed to be. "We should not do this," he said, his voice steady again, controlled, but there was something in it that had not been there before, something that suggested the decision was not as simple as it sounded. Lily nodded slowly, though the feeling in her chest did not settle, did not return to what it had been before. "No," she agreed softly. But as they stood there, the city still glowing beneath them, both of them knew that something had already changed, something that could not be undone, and no matter how carefully they tried to step back into the roles they had agreed on, the truth was already there, quiet but undeniable, waiting for the moment it would no longer be ignored. The fallout did not come with raised voices or dramatic confrontations. It came quietly, in the way everything between them shifted back into place, as if that moment on the balcony had never happened, and somehow that made it worse, because pretending it did not exist required more effort than acknowledging it ever would have. The next few days moved with a precision that felt almost deliberate, Ethan returning to the version of himself Lily had first met, composed, distant, his words measured, his presence controlled, and if there was any trace of what had nearly happened, it was buried beneath layers of professionalism so carefully rebuilt that it left no room for anything else. Lily noticed it immediately, not because he said anything different, but because he did not say anything at all, the small questions gone, the quiet moments erased, replaced by schedules and instructions and polite acknowledgments that sounded exactly like they were supposed to, and yet felt entirely different now. She told herself it was necessary, that this was how things were meant to be, that they had both agreed to this, but the space between them no longer felt neutral, it felt intentional, like a line that had been redrawn with sharper edges than before. The gala that followed was supposed to be just another event, another evening of appearances and conversations. But from the moment Lily stepped into the room, she felt it, the shift in the air, the way eyes lingered a little longer, the way voices lowered just slightly when she passed. And she understood without needing anyone to explain that something had changed, not just between her and Ethan, but in how others saw her, how they questioned her place in a world that was never meant to be hers. "You have adapted quickly," a woman said to her with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, her tone light, but edged with something sharper beneath the surface. Almost too quickly. Lily returned the smile, steady, composed, but she felt it, the implication behind the words, the suggestion that she did not belong here on her own merit, that she was something temporary, something replaceable. Ethan stood beside her, close enough for appearances, distant enough to feel it, his attention shifting between conversations, his expression unreadable, and for a moment, Lily waited, not consciously, not with expectation, but with a quiet hope that he might say something, that he might step in, that he might remind them, and maybe even her, that she was not just part of an arrangement. But he did not. The conversation moved on, the subtle tension dissolving into polite laughter and practiced exchanges, and Lily felt something settle in her chest, something heavier than before, something that did not come from what had been said, but from what had not. Later that evening, the situation escalated in a way that left little room for interpretation. A conversation turned public, a question asked just loud enough to draw attention, about timelines, about authenticity, about how long something like this could possibly last, and though no one said the word contract, it lingered in the air, unspoken but understood, and all eyes turned, not to Ethan, but to her. Lily held her ground, her posture steady, her voice calm as she responded with the grace she had learned, deflecting without revealing, maintaining the illusion they had built together, but inside, something shifted, something that no amount of composure could fully contain. Ethan spoke then, finally, but his words were careful, strategic, addressing the room rather than her, protecting the image rather than the person, and Lily understood in that moment exactly where she stood, not beside him, not truly, but within the boundaries of something that had always been conditional. The drive home was silent, the city lights passing by in a blur that Lily barely noticed, her thoughts louder than anything else, and when they reached the penthouse, she did not wait for him to speak, did not wait for explanations or reassurances that might not come. "You were right," she said quietly, setting her bag down with a controlled motion, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. Ethan looked at her, his expression tightening slightly, as if he already knew where this was going. "This was the most efficient choice," she continued, repeating his own words back to him, not with bitterness, but with clarity. But it was never real. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument, and for the first time since this began, Lily did not feel uncertain about what came next, because some things, once seen clearly, could not be unseen, and no matter how carefully they had built this arrangement, no matter how convincing it had become, she finally understood the one truth that mattered most, that she had stepped into something designed to end, and somewhere along the way, she had almost forgotten that. And that was the part that hurt the most. 6 years did not pass all at once. They unfolded quietly, in days that turned into routines and routines that turned into a life Lily built piece by piece, without ever looking back, not because she forgot, but because she chose not to stand still in a story that had already ended. The morning she left, there were no raised voices, no dramatic goodbye, just the soft click of the door closing behind her and the steady rhythm of her footsteps as she walked away from everything that had once felt larger than her own world. And in the weeks that followed, she learned how to exist again on her own terms, not as someone convincing, not as someone expected to fit into a space that was never hers, but simply as herself. It was not easy, not at first, the comfort she had known replaced by uncertainty, The quiet security of that life exchanged for long days and careful decisions. But there was something different this time, something stronger beneath it all, because she was no longer the same person who had signed that contract, no longer someone who doubted whether she belonged anywhere at all. She found work, not immediately, not without effort, but with persistence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of, and slowly, steadily, she built something of her own, a life that did not depend on anyone else's expectations, a path that moved forward instead of waiting for something to return. Meanwhile, Ethan Carter continued exactly as he always had, at least on the surface, his world unchanged, his schedule full, his decisions precise, the kind of man who moved forward without hesitation because that was what he had always done. But beneath it, something had shifted in a way he could not ignore, not when the silence in his penthouse felt different. Not when the absence of someone who had once been part of his daily life became something he noticed more than he expected. He told himself it was temporary, that time would settle it, that everything would return to what it had been before, but it did not. And that was the part he had not accounted for, the part no contract could define. The years passed, marked by achievements, by numbers that grew and deals that closed, by recognition that confirmed everything he had built. And yet none of it filled the space that had quietly formed, the space left by something he had chosen not to hold on to when he had the chance. And then, one day, without warning, the call came. The same call that now echoed in his hand as he stood in that quiet penthouse, the voice on the other end steady but careful, as if aware of the weight of what it carried. She listed you as an emergency contact. The voice said, breaking the silence that had stretched just a second too long. And Ethan felt something shift in his chest, something immediate, something undeniable. Is she all right? He asked, the words coming faster than he intended, sharper than his usual control allowed. And for the first time in a long time, there was no distance in his voice, no calculated tone, just something real, something he had not used in years. There was a pause, not long, but enough to make the moment feel heavier. She is stable, the voice replied gently. But she asked for you. The words settled in a way nothing else had, cutting through years of silence, through everything he had built to move forward. And in that instant, Ethan understood something he had refused to admit before, something simple and unavoidable, that no matter how far time had carried them, no matter how much had changed, there were some connections that did not disappear, some choices that did not lose their weight, and some people who, even after everything, remained exactly where they had always been, just waiting for the moment they were finally seen again. The drive to the hospital felt longer than any distance Ethan had ever measured, not because of traffic or time, but because every second carried something he had spent 6 years avoiding. And now there was no space left to avoid it, no distance left to hide behind, just the steady realization that whatever waited at the end of that drive was not something he could control or calculate. The building rose ahead, clean and quiet under the early morning light. And as he stepped inside, the air felt different, softer, quieter in a way that forced everything else to slow down. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan did not walk with the same certainty, his steps measured but no longer detached, his focus narrowing to a single question that had not left his mind since the call. When he reached the front desk and gave her name, the nurse nodded with recognition, as if expecting him, and guided him down a hallway that seemed longer than it should have been. Each step echoing faintly, each second stretching just enough to make him feel it, the weight of everything he had not said, everything he had not done, everything he had let pass without choosing differently. The door was already slightly open when he arrived, and for a moment, he did not step inside, his hand resting lightly against the frame as if crossing that threshold would make everything real in a way he was not prepared for. But then he saw her, and hesitation was no longer an option. Lily sat near the window, the morning light falling softly across her face, her posture calm, her expression quiet but aware, and when she turned her head and saw him standing there, something shifted in her eyes, not surprise, not shock, but recognition, like a moment that had been waiting had finally arrived. For a second, neither of them spoke, the silence carrying more than words ever could, and then Ethan stepped forward slowly, closing the distance that had once felt so easy to maintain and now felt impossible to justify. You called me, he said, his voice lower than usual, less controlled, more honest than it had been in years, and Lily gave a small nod, her gaze steady on his. I did, she replied softly. The simplicity of it made everything else fall away, the years, the distance, the reasons they had both held on to, leaving only the truth that neither of them had been able to change, no matter how much time had passed. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hand tightening slightly at his side as he took another step closer. I should have come sooner, he said, the words quiet but heavy, carrying more than just the moment, carrying everything that had been left unfinished. Lily studied him for a brief moment, as if measuring the weight of what he had said, then shook her head gently. You came now, she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, no bitterness, just a calm acceptance that made it harder, not easier, to stand there in front of her. Ethan let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his gaze dropping briefly before returning to hers. I thought I made the right choice, he admitted, his voice steady but no longer distant. I thought keeping things clear, controlled, would make everything easier. Lily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not from amusement, but from understanding. Did it? She asked quietly. The question lingered, simple but impossible to answer with anything other than the truth, and Ethan shook his head slightly, the movement small but certain. No, he said. The honesty settled between them, not as something fragile, but as something solid, something that did not need to be hidden anymore. And for the first time since that night on the balcony, there were no rules shaping what came next, no contract defining the boundaries, just two people standing in the same space again, without the distance that had once separated them. Ethan reached into his coat pocket then, his fingers closing around something he had not touched in years, something he had kept without fully understanding why. And when he pulled it out, it was simple, familiar, the ring that had once been part of an arrangement, now held differently, not as a symbol of obligation, but as something he was choosing for the first time. This was supposed to mean nothing, he said, his voice quieter now, more certain in a different way. But I was wrong. Lily looked at the ring, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a moment, and Ethan took a small step closer, not out of confidence, but out of something deeper, something that no longer needed to be calculated. This time, he continued, his gaze steady, there is no contract. The words hung in the air, simple but undeniable, and for a second, everything else faded, the past, the mistakes, the years they had spent apart, leaving only the choice in front of them now, a choice that neither of them could make based on obligation or expectation, only on what was real. Lily's eyes softened slightly, the distance that had once been there no longer present, and though she did not answer immediately, the silence between them felt different, not uncertain, not guarded, but open, like something new had been given the space to begin, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Ethan did not try to control the outcome. He simply waited, knowing that whatever came next would not be decided by a contract, but by something far more honest than that.